This session, we wanted to have you hear some perspectives of some of the thought leaders that we've had working with us. Chris Deedy is kind of this guru around scale, and he's written a lot of different things, and if scale comes up, his name is completely, totally associated with it. So he was a no-brainer that when we said we were looking at scale, he had to be here. Jim Deering has looked at diffusion of innovation, and it was a really interesting concept that was very much parallel with it, and we said, oh, well, this could be very interesting to have him work with us as well. And then we started looking at story and the power and the influence of that, and Ty came into this because he's done a lot of work in Native America storytelling and various therapy types of activities, et cetera. So they've been working with us for a couple of years. And so we wanted to have you hear some of the things that happened with them and how they've contributed and, you know, what they think about what has happened within this group. So,
welcome.
Thank you, Deborah.
In my background is in two levels. One is I was with the National Bilingual Training and Resource Center. So I have a background in terms of bilingual education and working with different programs. Because I was working primarily with Alaskan programs, the government of Canada came to me and said, we have the same languages in the Northwest Territories as Alaska because it's an artificial boundary. Would you be willing to come out and do training for our teachers and working with bilingual education with Native programs in Canada? And so I started going all across Canada in terms of doing something similar. And I found that very useful in terms of looking at the way of how do you scale. How do you use different languages in terms of using the same tools and techniques that seem to be effective in terms of making a difference? And the other thing that was exciting to me about coming here in terms of working with Synergy is I've also worked with two different programs that were established as best practices. And one was with SAMHSA in terms of Native American substance abuse prevention. I was chief curriculum writer for something called GONA. And the other one was for something called Project REACH with the Department of Education, which worked with anti-racism discrimination. The program was created just outside of Seattle. And it gave us an opportunity to do that kind of outreach in terms of how do you get this information out, how do you train people, how do you get a similar product that's coming back. And coming in to work with Synergy, my background is also as a family therapist. And there's something called a life script, which is the idea that sometimes stories are so powerful that you don't necessarily tell a story, but a story starts to tell you. And one of the things that often happens when there's pathology or when there's a real behavioral problem is that people will often be trapped in a story in terms of how they identify themselves and the kind of patterns of behaviors that then they take on in terms of relating with other people. And so coming into Synergy was an opportunity for me, which was very exciting, to teach people about the idea of stories and to get people to tell the stories themselves. There was also a presentation on Science Friday in an interview with Alan Alda in terms of him saying, as someone who interviews a lot of scientists himself, he would be in a situation of watching very respected, very well-trained, very highly intelligent scientists being interviewed by congressional Senate committees. And it'd be the sort of thing where they were experts in their field, but they were not able to communicate what it is that they were doing, which had an impact in terms of whether or not they would be funded by Congress or not. And the idea that the congressmen might be well educated, but they weren't from that discipline, so they didn't have any idea what it was that the scientists were talking about. And so we've been looking at the idea of how do you communicate the story in a way that you're in control of the narrative to be able to make a difference with the people that you're working with. It's also that people relate to stories very much in a very powerful way. And so I've been enjoying my opportunity to come with Synergy, but coming from those perspectives in terms of having worked on a number of levels with trying to get dissemination of information out on a national level, but doing so not necessarily always with science, but sometimes with mental health, sometimes with bilingual education, and seeing and racism discrimination issues, how those things overlap each other in terms of the techniques and what seems to be most effective. And I'll just do one more thing, then I'll turn it over to my colleagues here. The idea that I've been doing this for a number of years, and periodically when I'm in an airport, someone will run up to me and said, 10 years ago, I saw you at a conference in Nashville, and you told, and they'll tell me the story that I told. And they'll say, you know, I don't remember what the conference was about, but I remember the story that you told. And this is the way that people think. They think in terms of stories. And there was a Nobel Prize winner named Peter Medawar who wrote a book called Pluto's Republic. And he heard this at a party, and he thought, Pluto's Republic? Pluto is Mickey Mouse's dog. And it was the idea of how information gets distorted when you share things with one another. And so the thing that he said that really stuck with me is, as a Nobel Prize winning scientist, he said, we as scientists think in terms of stories, but we've been trained to share information in terms of A plus B equals C, because that's the way we do the academic publications. But then we mislead the public and we mislead others in the way of this is how we are actually thinking along these lines. And if we drop off in somebody else's lab, one of the things we ask is, how's the story going? Have you figured the story out yet? And this is one of the things in terms of giving permission for people to tell their own stories, which will start to resonate with one another. One of the exciting things about working with music is that if you have a guitar on one side of the room and you pluck a string on it, if you have a really well-tuned guitar on the other side of the room, that same string will start to resonate. And this is one of the things that starts to happen when you start to learn to tell your story effectively, that it starts to resonate in other people in terms of making them want to tell their story to you as well. Okay?
It was more than 6 years ago, actually, when I first became involved with Synergy as a process, even though the proposal was just a gleam in the eye of the leadership team at that point. There was a Synergy conference in Boston in 2006, and I came and did a talk for that. And I was thinking, almost 6 years ago, if you date my professional life from the time that I got my doctorate, that's over a seventh of my professional life. That's pretty impressive. Another year, it would be longer than my first marriage. And that's interesting in and of itself as a comparison, because for consultants, a one-night stand is much more typical than a marriage with your clients. This is not at our instigation. I mean, we get a call from somebody and they say, why don't you come and we'll do some things together, and we do things together in an intense period of time, and we say, gee, when can we get together again? And they say, well, we'll call you, you know, when you're needed, we'll call you. And it's the nature of consulting, but it's always nice to have a relationship that's sustained, and this has certainly been one of the longest and most productive relationships of my professional life. It's also led me to understand my limits, because the 6th time that the leadership team came to me and said, could you give a different presentation about scale? I said, well, no. I'm at the bottom of the barrel. I have no way of doing that again. You'll have to give me something else to do. So I was thinking about what I had learned from Jim and from Ty, and a week ago, I was at the NSF DRK-12 program Principal Investigators meeting, and I was part of a workshop that we were doing, and I found myself giving a presentation on knowledge diffusion. Not because I'd been asked to do that, but there I was. I was doing a Jim Deering imitation, and it was amazing to me. I wasn't talking about scale. I was talking about knowledge diffusion and hopefully doing credit to it. So imitation is the sincerest form of flattery, and I guess that says I've learned a lot from Jim. I did a talk at DRK-12 that involved a story, and I'm going to do a modification of that talk Friday. I'm a little nervous about doing it in front of the master storyteller, but I know Ty well enough to know that he will be gentle in any suggestions that he has for how I could do better. So for me, I feel as if I have learned a lot from my colleagues here in terms of how how to combine these three things of story and diffusion and scale. It's almost like being able to see an object in 3 dimensions now, to have those 3 perspectives. And as I watch the centers present today, I'm struck by the fact that you too have interwoven those. The nanotech presentation had a story. It used a lot of knowledge diffusion techniques, and it was about scale. It's been a real privilege to work with you as community college centers. I came into Synergy over 6 years ago feeling that community colleges were the most innovative part of higher education, and this experience has only deepened that feeling. And it's also been, for me, a community that's very similar in its own objectives to mine. I feel often out of place at Harvard because a lot of my colleagues are kind of, the reason that they do what they do is they love being scholars. The reason that they do what they do is they love having status. And I do what I do because I want to help students. And that's absolutely the culture of the community college and the culture of Synergy. And so it's been a real privilege to work with people who are like that. I tried to think of what I would do differently if somehow I was in a time machine. I could go back to 2008 and start the process again, knowing more this time about it. And I think I would want to take with me in the time machine something I didn't have in 2008 that now you have given me, which is cases of centers that have successfully applied this process. Because I do some case-based teaching. A lot of my colleagues do much more case-based teaching. And one of the things I think we recognize is the case has to be pretty similar to you. That if the case sounds dissimilar, it just doesn't transfer or generalize very easily. And there weren't cases that I knew about for community colleges, but now there are. And so that's a real gift that lets us move forward. The other thing I found myself wondering about is, what if we had just done this for 3 weeks? Just sort of gone to Las Vegas, and locked ourselves in a hotel for 3 weeks, at least during the day, and just done it all in one intensive burst. Now, obviously, you couldn't have done your part of it all in one intensive burst, but I think that as a consultant, I've struggled to get that kind of sense of immersion, because we learn when we're deeply immersed in something, and yet when there's 6-month intervals, it's hard to reestablish that sense of immersion, and yet I feel that every time we get together it comes more quickly. So just some sort of random thoughts about what this has meant for me.
I wanted to add something too, because one of the things that we discussed is that one of the things we've learned from Synergy too, it's not a lineal directive thing. It's the idea that often it's a dance back and forth in terms of something that you will say will spark something in me that would take me in a different direction than I would have gone by myself. And one of the things that really strikes me, since I've worked so many years as a consultant, it's one of those things where you fly in, you do your presentation, you give a keynote, and then you wave and fly out again. And I would rarely get a chance to interact with the people in the audience before I would have to leave for the airport and go to another conference. And one of the things I'd missed so much in terms of working as a family therapist is that as a family therapist you get to see the growth and change development, the alteration and the maturation that's going on. As a university professor, I would get to see students do that same thing over a semester in terms of them understanding and being in a very different place at the end of the semester. And as a conference consultant, I really didn't have that. That I didn't see that what I did had an impact with people. And the first Synergy conference I was presenting at in Phoenix back in whatever it was, 2010, 2011 or something, that it was an opportunity to stay the next 2 days and hear people actually pick up some of the elements of the stories that I had shared, or go, oh, this is what I remember this in terms of how it applies, and I understand how it can then be used by my program too. And that's something I really haven't had a chance for in a very long time in terms of getting that feedback. And it's also getting the opportunity to see that growth and development and change that by coming here every 6 months and seeing people, even if it's not always the same people, the same centers are being represented. And so I'm getting feedback in terms of how you're using this information to make a difference as well.
The comments here, they make me think of a trip I took last week. I went to Manhattan and flew there from Denver, Colorado, and I was going to work with a group. They call themselves the Work Family Health Network. They create innovations in work-family balance. Now, I'm not exactly sure what that is because I don't have too much work-family balance, but perhaps you have work-family balance. I hope that you do. If you don't, that's a good reason for this network to exist. So as the cab driver was taking me from LaGuardia to the hotel in Manhattan last week, I started to remember that about 8 years prior, I had driven a car from LaGuardia and turned where this cab driver didn't turn, and I had gone up the Hudson River Valley. And if you do that, if you drive up, it's very beautiful. If you drive up the Hudson River Valley, you can eventually come to the old family summer home of the Rockefeller Foundation. It's a little like a castle compared to where I live, but it's a big, beautiful old estate. I was brought there about 8 years ago with some other people by an organization called the McDonald Foundation, based, I believe, in St. Louis. And the McDonald Foundation, it's a small private foundation. They have a very narrow mission, which is laudatory, I think. Their mission is to fund brain research that's so wildly different, it's so radical, that it can't get funded through the normal peer review processes of the National Institutes of Health. So these are very innovative people, presumably, who receive these grants from the McDonald Foundation. So why was I there? I'm not a brain researcher. Well, you know the answer. I was there because the McDonald Foundation figured that some of these crazy ideas that had very positive results maybe warranted spread. Maybe they shouldn't just be the province of a university laboratory. They could help other people. So I go and I talk with this group, kind of the one-night stand that Ty was referring to. And, you know, they seem interested in what I'm saying to them. And then they begin to describe the types of brain research innovations that they've been working on. And one fellow in particular from the University of Alabama, Birmingham, very, very bright fellow, had created, through laboratory testing and clinical testing, he'd created a way to help stroke victims recover much more rapidly after a stroke by, after people would have a stroke, after a patient would have a stroke, one part of the body often is paralyzed. What this fellow and his lab assistants had done was to inhibit the good part of the person's body. Usually, stroke recuperation doesn't work this way, which is why maybe the McDonald Foundation funded this study, because it was kind of radical. So if Ty isn't all of a sudden able to use the left side of his body, this fellow and his research assistants in Birmingham would tie back the right side, right? The right leg, the right arm, and thus you're forcing not just a physical immobility type of recuperation, but a cognitive regeneration of mental processes, synapse processes that had been harmed through the stroke. And I'm listening to this and I'm thinking, wow, this is incredible. They had wonderful data to back up the efficacy of this. And what had they done in terms of spread or knowledge diffusion? What had they done to publicize their research, to tell others about this process that was so effective? Well, the university had engaged in a rapid barrage of media publicity, and they'd gotten media publicity. They had about 10 days of very high, solid publicity in the New York Times. They were in the Wall Street Journal. They were in Time magazine. They hit all the general population highlights. And then, of course, all the attention went away, which is the tendency of mass media. They go on to the next big thing. So I was listening to this, and some people there thought this was a wonderful success. They got all that media publicity. Everyone knew about it now. You know the answer to that. Usually, knowledge diffusion just results in knowing and then forgetting, and never trying or adopting or adapting or implementing or any other important kind of outcome that we might care about. And so what I learned about this group of very, very bright brain researchers at the old Rockefeller family home on the Hudson River was that they were very good at research, very, very good, and they didn't know a damn thing about dissemination or being strategic. That is, they hadn't applied the same analytic processes that they regularly engage in as scientists to the processes of scale or spread. They were acting like debutantes when it came to really trying to move their research results into broad practice. So I came away from that meeting not so impressed with this group of researchers. Great basic researchers and not interested in dissemination. I tell you this story because it's one of the things that I've learned from you, from this group, is that your interest, your creativity, your insights don't stop with the creation of your innovations themselves. That much is clear, as we've already heard from presentations earlier today, and as we've already heard from prior meeting presentations. And I hope that we'll continue to document collectively as a group. You seem to be just as interested in issues of scale and spread as you are in the processes of creating a new way to help students or creating a new way to engage a business community, etc. So I think that's a marvelous quality that speaks a lot to your intellect and to your fortitude in sticking with a topic and seeing it through. We're not done, of course, as a group. We're in some ways just beginning, even though, as Chris says, it does seem like it's been a long engagement so far. But the fact of the matter is, you do a marvelous job in staying in the question, in adapting yourselves to not just focusing on your intervention or innovation itself, but in now learning a variety of concepts and then trying them out and using the ones that work and modifying them in the process. It's very impressive.
Also, the U.S. Chamber of Commerce came out recently with a report in terms of looking at the effectiveness of college education. And one of the exciting things to me, having survived academia, we were discussing the issue of faculty meetings as being an occupational hazard, that one of the things that I'm seeing with what goes on with a lot of your centers is how closely tied some of you are to stakeholders within the corporate community, the business community. So you can actually measure in a way that the U.S. Chamber of Commerce was not finding with a lot of other colleges, how you're really cooperating with them in terms of providing students that have a direct connection to the real opportunities of employment and change that are possible out there. And it's something that I think, when I look at the criticism that's being leveled against universities and colleges in general, Synergy is a remarkable answer to say, here's a very different direction that can be taken in terms of making sure you can actually document and prove that the kind of education you're providing to your students is exactly what the industry and what some of the corporations are looking for in terms of their new hires. Because when the U.S. Chamber of Commerce interviewed a number of the businesses, their response was, we don't really think at this point a lot of the college-educated students who show up with these kind of certifications or degrees really have the skill set necessary in terms of what it is we're looking for. And also, I just wanted to add one other thing that I forgot to mention. I'm the product of community college. Although I'm so old, I'm actually the product of a junior college. And my AA degree that I received from Broward Junior College, which is now Broward Community College, really made a difference for me when I then transferred to a 4-year institution. because my classes were different, the kind of attentiveness, the intensity of connection with my professors at that time was so different than what I had experienced when I went on to the University of South Florida. And I think I would have been a very different person if I had not had those first 2 years in terms of making a difference, particularly because I was so young when I was actually there. I graduated when I was 16, and so the junior college was a very good fit for me at that particular stage of my development, where I think I would have really been lost if I'd gone from a small high school into an enormous four-year college.
So when I saw this on the program, this session, I was thinking, well, first I thought the Three Stooges, and then I thought, no, that's the wrong analogy. The Three Wise Men, the Three Wise Men. But the fact that there were three wise men is interesting, because if somebody is really wise, wouldn't you need just one? And I think the answer is no. I think the answer is, I don't know about the three, but that multiple perspectives is really important rather than just one perspective deeply. And so I tried to think a bit about how what Jim and Ty contribute fill out the perspective that I bring. And I think one of the things I've learned in the synergy process is that the scale framework is a very intellectual perspective. It's a very cognitive perspective. It's very logical. But a lot of scale and spread is about relationships. It's a psychosocial process. And if you look at the different dimensions that Jim talks about with diffusion, having something be consistent or seem to be consistent with what you're already doing is saying, I care about you and this is a way of empowering you. Having something seem simple in terms of how you adapt it is again saying, I care about you and how this works for you. And I don't know whether the research would support this, but having somebody that you trust already doing it, and so being willing to do it because of that person you trust. If I had to pick one out of the 7 things in knowledge diffusion that I would guess would be the most powerful, it would be that one. And that's about relationships. And then, I mean, story is really inadequate as a word to describe what Ty does, because there are lots of different kinds of stories, and some stories are really pretty superficial. But Ty's stories, I think, remind us of things about ourselves and about relationships that we share with other people, with common elements that we all have in the process of being human. And that's emotional, social as well. So I feel as if I'm glad I've got 2 other wise men with me, because I need those other 2 dimensions.
Well, you know, one of the things that really struck me and has stayed with me was that for those of you who have been to a number of sessions, one of the presentations that Chris did was showing a visual that has this wonderful wooden carving. And depending on how the light is shined upon it, it actually gives a different image. And that stayed with me very strongly. And when my background was in teaching and education specifically, it was the idea that as human beings, we've evolved to be very responsive to visual stimulation. But literacy is a relatively new human development. And so you're hardwired to respond in a very different way to the image than you are to the words themselves in terms of communication. I also was one of the founders of Red Earth Performing Arts Company in terms of working with Native American theater. And we got someone who had been trained with Marcel Marceau. And one of the things he said, which also always stuck with me, was as a mime, and yeah, Marcel would actually speak to people in terms of teaching them, but what he talked about was that when you're on stage, even though you're a mime, you must always be in constant movement because of the way the human body is wired, your neurology, that you are hardwired in terms of picking up when a difference makes a difference, so that as you shift, your attention is focused. And if you're a lecturer, if you're a presentation, and there's not that movement, and this is one of the things of the presentation that you just saw with the Mint, the idea that it has very strong visual stimulation in terms of constantly re-engaging you in a way a static image will not necessarily do so. And just as Chris's magic letter, in terms of that particular wood and carving, had such a powerful visual stimulation for me, one of the things that I've always tried to do when I'm doing the presentations is use some kind of strong visual element that's there, so that even if they don't have the words go with them, the image of the particular thing, and I will often do things that are funny in terms of using cartoon images or that are not unexpected sort of images, are also trying to do things where you're presenting something new in a familiar way, or you're trying to present something familiar in a new way, so that people are able to understand it from those different dimensional or levels of understanding. And this is one of the things in terms of what's fun for me in terms of coming to Synergy, because it's looking at what are the different ways that I can give you images that you can take with you that are matching what you're doing, but may not have been something that you thought about using that particular way before.
And that notion of teaching, or kind of guided inquiry, of giving images, offering ideas, offering concepts, to me that sounds like at least how we began this process, how the three of us began this process. And we even did a little bit, we were farsighted enough to think anyway, that we might begin as teachers and might end up as students. But in my case, I didn't understand how many notes I'd be taking as a student, which is really, really delightful, and certainly true. And obviously, as evidenced a couple hours ago, not done either. I have a secret note. And the secret says, would you like to entertain questions? Does anyone have?
I'm willing to entertain answers, too.
Comments are fine.
I'm going to hand a microphone over for people interested in comments or questions.
So this is my first year here. So if you were to have a couple hours with those scientists in Alabama and tell them how to disseminate their really important research, what would you tell them? Because I think I'm new here. I'm trying to absorb something. So if you could just tell me in a few minutes, that would be great.
The thing that struck me initially about hearing their presentations was that for one thing, there was no follow-through. There was no plan in terms of dissemination. They weren't being strategic. They were just turning over results of their study to, what do we call it? The university outreach office, the publicity office, the communications unit, and someone writes a press release and sends it out, and sometimes they get picked up, but we know how media attention goes, especially mass media attention. It's always episodic. So, and moreover, it's mass media attention. It's closer to entertainment than it is to education, I think, and it suggests no targeting, no careful thought at all. I guess the takeaway I had from that experience was that these were scientists, very, very bright scientists, who, like many scientists or researchers, have no interest whatsoever in getting into the wicked problems of scale or spread. They didn't want to do that. They didn't see it as their job. They didn't know how to do it, right? They could be interested and not know how. They could know how and not be interested. They were neither. They just didn't, it wasn't their job. And they really didn't want to learn about it. So I, of course, like many of you, would think to be much more targeted in outreach or dissemination strategy. That is, who are the likely potential adopters in question, and how can we support their inquiries if we can manage to get their attention? there are a variety of planning questions along those lines. But for me, a lot of it starts with thinking through who plausibly would be interested in this. So the New York Times can be a useful outlet for catching the attention of other people, for kind of setting an agenda just as a signal that something is societally important. But the readers of the Times are not the target audience. In some ways, it's kind of silly, especially if you're going to put much effort trying to get such attention. Other questions or comments?
I think we all can agree that relationship is very important within a community to strengthen it and bring the different diverse aspects. But what about the university relationship? As you said, the university just disseminates the information as they see it and then hopes somebody will grab it. But unless somebody's initiating that, how do we get that innovation down into the innovative band? I heard that community colleges right now are probably the most innovative when it comes to higher ed right now. How do we get that connection? How do we, I mean, is it our responsibility necessary to go out to universities? Where does that happen? Can you talk a little bit about that as far as relationships and university and community college? Who should initiate? Where do we find those opportunities?
One of the things that has been, as I look at some of the feedback from higher education, that there's a mindset in terms of being a college or a university that you get funding from the state or you get funding from a national grant or something. And as our economy has tanked, there's been such tremendous cutbacks in terms of state funding for different programs. And it either means that you cut back tremendously in terms of what it is that you can offer because your resources have been reduced, or you start looking in very different directions in terms of who are the stakeholders that are involved. And this is the exciting thing to me about a number of the centers who are working with the different industries in such a direct relationship that simply doesn't go on in the same way with a four-year institution or graduate programs. And that's part of the thinking outside of the box again in terms of who are the stakeholders that are involved. How is it that I get their interest in terms of, this is part of the storytelling too. How do I learn how to tell the story of what it is that I'm doing that makes you want to be a part of it? And that is a skill set. And one of the things that was fascinating to me is I had a Ford Foundation Fellowship for American Indians. And because I had that, suddenly my mailbox was full from invitations from universities across the United States wanting me to be part of them because the Ford Foundation Fellowship is portable. I could take it to any place I went. And I got this little pitiful mimeograph letter brochure from the University of Washington for an Institute in Indian Studies that was the idea that they had gotten a grant to teach Native students how to teach Indian studies on a college level. And so they got funding specifically to bring in 28 Indian graduate students from around the United States and Indian faculty from different universities and colleges around the United States. So suddenly I went from having never having a Native professor before, where all my professors are Native people. And they were able to model for me and teach me things that non-Native faculty would not have been able to do in exactly the same way. And this whole idea in terms of realizing that I was there, I was suddenly the second week dragged over from the Indian Studies Department to the Department of Education because they had gotten a grant to establish a Center for Indian Teacher Education. And I said, I don't want a degree in education. I have my life planned out for me, and that's not part of it. And they said, if you don't get a degree in education, you don't get any more money. And so in addition to having my fellowship from the Ford Foundation, I got an additional fellowship support from the Department of Education for Indian Education. So I actually made more money as a graduate student than I did my first job when I went out in the real world. But the reason I'm sharing this with you is that when I talked to them, I said, well, what sort of degrees can I get? And I discovered that the only Master's of Education degree I could get that required no experience in teaching was in higher education. So I have a degree in higher education, and I've actually been trained to administer a small liberal arts college. But it meant that I would sit in presentations where I would be lectured that the poorest way of disseminating information is by a lecture. And I was being lectured this information. And I was sitting at the desk thinking there's something terribly wrong with this picture. And it's the idea a lot of people who are very well trained in their particular discipline don't have the additional skill set, which is a different set of skills of dissemination, of teaching, of pedagogy, and these all sorts of things, of communication skills that are not taught in conjunction with the kind of discipline that they're offered. And this is, again, what's exciting to me about what you're doing. The very nature of synergy is forcing you to learn additional skills that in some ways, Jim's background is a certain marketing technique. And I don't mean that in a decisive way. It was one of the things I really learned from Jim, that I've never really thought about dissemination and in that particular way in terms of marketing, because I was looked down on marketing. And I've always laughed with my domestic partner in terms of, look at the product placement that's going on right here. Look at American Idol in terms of how they turn the camera angles to make sure that you see the Coke logo no matter what camera is on. And I always kind of dismissed it in that particular way. But one of the things I've learned from Jim is to look at the idea that there's a science behind that. The idea of how you do disseminate, because that's a type of marketing, but it's a very specialized type of marketing.
As you were talking, I was thinking about the Olympics coming up in London and the fact that there really are two kinds of races. There are races where there's one runner, and then there are relay races. And the concept, I guess, behind a relay race is that 4 people can run a distance faster than 1 person can. And I think that's a principle that our society, for better or for worse, really adopted in the industrial period, that everybody specialized on doing a part of a process, and then you put your assembly line together, and you could produce the overall artifact more efficiently. I think a lot of us now in education feel like a relay runner who's done their part of the race, and there's nobody there to hand the baton to, right? The process is broken. It's broken at an individual level, and it's broken at an institutional level, too. So the university says, well, this is our mission, and it stops here. But we don't want it to stop there. We want it to keep going because we want the thing that we do actually to be used. So I feel as if in my own career, and many of you may have this feeling too, or you may be getting this feeling through the synergy process, we're finding that we have to keep running, even though we've done our part of the race, because there is nobody to hand off the baton to. And maybe part of why we need the community is to give us all the courage to keep running into the territory that we weren't prepared to run.
Actually, I want.
Okay.
It was a story, and I just want to tell a story because it affected me in my scientific career when I was a graduate student, and it relates to this, and that's the story of the chemiosmotic hypothesis, which we don't care about at the moment, other than to say that this was the idea that cells are actually batteries, and that the battery that a cell is creates chemicals that the cell then uses to run itself. So the cell is a battery. That's a chemiosmotic hypothesis. And Professor Peter Mitchell at the time in the 70s, who had this idea, wrote the papers and did all that stuff. But the thing that struck me back then in graduate school was that I had heard the anecdote that this was a controversial idea, of course, but he had in his lab a world map. And on that world map, he had pins. And every time he had somebody who would talk to him in a meeting or somewhere else and say, yeah, you know, this does make sense to me. I think you might be onto something here. He would stick a pin in a map in that place. And so he actually had a strategic plan, if you will, a strategic vision of how this scientific concept was going to be disseminated and scaled. And, well, he did win the Nobel Prize for it, so I guess he did the right thing.
Definitely a successful outcome.
Well, the 3 of us are waiting for our Nobel Prize.
Okay, thank you.